Amazon, $10, because my LASIK is still not. Got one for distance. On accident, they were supposed to be.
On. People can just hold these as well. No. As soon as it just come up.
Hollow bottoms. It's been. Doctor's really nice, but I did it the first time, and then they still haven't gotten it right. Well, one of them's right. This one's right.
Good, Susan. You made it.
I thought it was just me.
Yeah. He said he didn't.
Good morning, everybody. I promised everybody that we'd start promptly at 10 o'clock, so the hour has come. I want to welcome everybody here and appreciate your willingness to come in person for this discussion. I'm going to dispense with self-introductions because there are a lot of people who know each other, but I would ask that when you first speak, you identify yourself by name and organization. And then I think everybody, at least at the table, has made a name tag. That's good. Just help to know who's who and what the organizations are. A couple of logistics and ground rules. First of all, I'm Michael George. I'm the Delta Water Master, and I'm convening this discussion this morning, but it is being audio broadcast. So I would ask that when you speak into the microphone. The microphones have an on-off switch. It's right in the center of the front, and when it's live, the green light is on, and if the green light is on, the mic is not live. The meeting is also being recorded, so just keep that in mind. And really, the point of today is for discussion based on a lot of different experiences and different perspectives on issues related to how we can improve water management in the Delta during extended drought periods. We're in one now. Whether it persists or whether we get a break before the next one, we anticipate that these droughts are going to become more common and potentially longer in duration, creating additional challenges for water management in the Delta. There's no agenda for the meeting, no presentations. It's unlike a workshop where traditionally staff presents kind of what their thinking is and then asks for comment and feedback. Here we're just looking for feedback, especially on the central topic of how we can improve water management in the Delta during extended droughts. So I hope we can be candid and respectful and stick to the topic and share airtime. I think most of us are likely to do a lot more listening than talking, but I think around the table and around the room, participants should feel free to ask questions or to elicit information from others at the table on topics that we're discussing. We're exploring ideas here. I don't expect any specific recommendation to come out. Potentially some suggestions or ideas here will be developed as we go forward. But my hope is that we will be candid and nothing that anybody says will be held against them. I hear some chuckling from some lawyers, so we'll all be careful, but I also hope candid and focused on what we can do better. Obviously, the Delta is a critical resource for all of us, and therefore it's contentious in many ways. And drought exacerbates that competition among parties for the scarce resource. There are a lot of forums for engaging in those contests and resolving them. So we've got in the background here the existing drought, the risk of future droughts, increased probably in frequency and severity because of climate change. As you all know, the Water Board will consider next Wednesday renewal of emergency regulations on curtailment. You've perhaps seen or had a chance to look at the summary and report on an investigation that the Division of Water Rights and the Office of Delta Water Master, with the participation of a number of complainants, have concluded after a year into the allegation of unlawful diversion in the Delta. There's also a lot of litigation on various things that are in the background of this discussion. It's all part of the milieu in which we come together, but I do want to emphasize that this meeting isn't intended to be part of the rulemaking process or the process to implement the existing or proposed regulations in terms of implementation through curtailment orders. So this isn't the right forum for that. Given the pending litigation on all of that, I'd ask everybody to refrain from commenting on the validity or propriety of the emergency regulation or curtailment orders and focus on what we can do better going forward, how we could improve implementation or management. You've all heard me before make the specific disclaimer that obviously I do not speak for the board. I have the opportunity and the privilege of advising them and getting direction from them, but I don't speak for them. And like a lot of us, I'm going to be trying to listen today. There are a number of Water Board staff members in the room, and I presume a number of them listening in as well, listening for suggestions, ideas, ways of improving what we're doing and how we could do it better. And so as I think about the discussion that I'd like to participate in, I've really focused on the fact that the risk of salinity intrusion is the issue, the risk, the concern that unites everybody. Because if there's simply insufficient freshwater flows through the Delta to maintain a freshwater estuary, that's a bad day at the office for everybody. It would impact, it would significantly degrade all the uses of the Delta, whether we look at it from a standpoint of ecosystem function or water supply, from a regulatory standpoint, an internal, interior Delta water user standpoint, export water user standpoint, from the perspective of environmental justice, and all the perspectives really come together in facing the risk of salinity intrusion. Project operators have specific responsibility in that area, but it is the risk that we all share. And we're searching for better ways to manage through persistent drought. As you all know, the board has asked and undoubtedly will continue to ask the staff to help develop options to improve water management in the course of these extended droughts. And as you all know, staff will make those recommendations. And I think today is an opportunity for discussion to help enlighten us, potentially broaden us, to think about what we might be able to do better, differently, et cetera. I do expect that there are board members who are listening and also potentially board members who will join us for part of the discussion. Again, because this is not part of the rulemaking process, I wouldn't expect them to have anything particular to say, but I think they will be listening and trying to absorb some of the ideas. So that's all I've got to say in terms of setting the stage. Again, I want to remind you that when you speak, turn the microphone on so that those listening outside can hear you. And when you first speak, it would be great if you'd identify yourself by name and organization. Russ?
Are we ready to go?
We're ready to go.
Yes, Michael, thank you for the introduction. This is Russ Ryan from Metropolitan Water District, as well as representing 4 reclamation districts in the Delta. My question is, I know we last year we had this Delta response pilot project, and forgive me if I'm not up to date, but I've heard, can you bring us a little bit up to date on that? And also, what is your vision for, do we extend this? Is there talk about, you know, what do we do for the next step, potentially for testing out conservation?
So I appreciate the question, and I think it is important because we have a significant experiment going on in the Delta right now. It's under the auspices of the Delta Conservancy. It's called the Delta Dry Year Response Pilot Program, and it was funded by a general fund through the Department of Water Resources that entered into an interagency agreement with the Conservancy to run the program. And it solicited ideas from agricultural operators within the Delta to propose actions that they would be willing to take for compensation in order to identify what actions could have the impact of, number one, potentially conserving water within the Delta and making that water exclusively available to improve Delta conditions, particularly water quality conditions. In other words, to conserve water in hopes of adding a bit of a buffer against salinity intrusion, against the deterioration of water quality. The program got 85 applications, 35 of them were funded, and are in the field today. So it's about 8,000 acres spread throughout the Delta, and farmers are taking actions. There's a whole suite of actions. We specifically wanted them to suggest to us, based on what they know about their fields, where they felt that they could do some conservation that would test out their theories about how to conserve water and how to reduce the risk of degraded water quality. So about 8,000 acres spread throughout the Delta, and we're monitoring it in 2 ways. Currently, we're monitoring it through OpenET, the satellite imaging ensemble method that I'm sure most of the people in the room are familiar with, and if you're not, you should get familiar with it. It's going to be an important evolving tool to give us closer to real-time data on crop ET within the Delta, which will be useful for a lot of reasons. We've only got the early data. We're, only 14th of July. The program goes through the end of the water year on September 30th. But there is enough promise in that program, and we've learned enough already, and facing the risk of persistence of the drought and knowing that we're going to go into the next water year with depleted reservoirs. The governor's budget included funding for this program next year to move from pilot program to an implementation program. We're developing some tweaks to the program based on what we've learned. We've been doing pretty intensive investigations, visits, and one of the things that I'm personally pleased about is the conversations with farmers in their fields or, in the front seat of their F-150s are incredibly informative. You can learn a lot more about what's going on in the Delta sitting in the front of the F-150 than you can on the 25th floor of this building, which is where I spend more of my time. In any case, we're learning a lot. It's still early. We're finding, as we expected, that a farmer can take the same action in two different places and have dramatically different outcomes in terms of water conservation and when it happens and how it happens. So we're trying to build on that to develop a program that will get into the field earlier next year. We began working on the pilot program in May of 2021, and we didn't get into the field. The Conservancy didn't release the request for applications until late January, and we're committed to getting into a program out on or about the 1st of October. And we're getting a lot of feedback from farmers about what to tweak, how to hunt more carefully for the best opportunities. So again, a lot of new and interesting and important data that's on the horizon, not yet available. And all of this will be, fully transparent. All the information is available on the Conservancy's website. We'll do reports and so forth. And also, importantly, the Department of Water Resources, under Anna Fox's direction, has entered into a contract with the University of California, Davis to do a substantial amount of ground truthing so that we can also have correlation and ground verification of what we're learning from the satellite imagery. Because of the supply chain issues and the need to acquire equipment to put in the field, that equipment is not in the field today. So right now, we're dealing with information available through OpenET, but for the next 3 years, under that coordinated agreement between DWR and UC Davis, we'll have a lot of ground truthing to go along with the eye in the sky. So thanks for that question. Are there other questions that people want to ask before we, or as we discuss what we can do better? What information you'd like to impart to the staff as we formulate ideas and options for the board to consider under the emergency regulations, or potentially enhancements or differences in that going forward?
Dante Nomalini with Central Delta Water Agency. I'll address the positive things we're doing other than defending positions and trying to protect water quality in the Delta. But we've been very active working with MET for years on gaming what would happen if the disaster that has been advertised due to earthquake or otherwise occurs. And so, and that has started with an approach from MET to the Central Delta Water Agency. And as all of you know, we are litigants on opposite sides in many arenas. And we are cooperatively and have been working on that. The idea was to protect they call it the Freshwater Corridor. And that's the ability to preserve the ability to get Sacramento River water over to the pumps. And of course, resist additional intrusion from the west. Because as we suffer levee failures, some of those draw significantly additional salt water from the west. So that is turning into, and I think we've had a lot of engineering done on trying to come up with an adequate engineering standard for the Delta, because what we're operating with now is not really an adequate standard. In fact, a lot of it is the the criteria that I helped institute for FEMA mitigation purposes back in the 80s. And that wasn't intended to be a solution, but a measure of progress only. But it's kind of become a standard. So we're working on the Freshwater Corridor with the idea of coming up with fortification of the levees, which is basically a wider crown that could accommodate raising without too much trouble in the event sea level rise manifests itself. And secondarily, in those areas where we have the deepest peat and the unstable foundations, widening the base of the levees. And so that is the effort that we have going. It includes the Western Delta Islands as well as those islands connecting the Sacramento River all the way over to the pumps. Now, there has been an intermediate effort, even with the Department of Water Resources programs, the levee subvention, and special projects, to treat the levees south of the San Joaquin over to the forebay and the federal pumps and try and fortify those. And we've done that. Local districts working primarily with East Bay mud, and in the case of Bacon Island, it had broader participation from other agencies that divert from the Delta. Those levees have been upgraded to meet the Bulletin 19282 standard. And if you go and see them, you're going to see their widened crowns, flattened back slopes, fortified foundations. We're kind of facing problems with regard to other actions in the Delta area that induce salinity intrusion. We've got one agency proposing deepening ship channels. We got other agencies, flooding the bottom end of the bypass that increases the tidal prism. There's problems with shortening the pass. The False River Barrier helps shorten, helps counteract the shortening of the path of salt water getting it into the pump. So those physical things we've dealt with. In addition to our freshwater corridor approach is to place locations where additional barriers or gates could be installed in an emergency that would keep intrusion from coming from Old River into the interior of the Delta. The initial thought from MET was Middle River corridor, but from a standpoint of the locals and trying to keep levees from failing in between, we have succeeded in introducing the Old River barrier or the corridor as the place to put the barriers. Otherwise, you have to maintain a levee in between your closures that's not protected on the inside. Erosion would eat that away, and unfortunately, almost every levee failure has a wind come up before you get the closure, and so you have the opportunity for failure. So we've been concentrating on the physical aspects of that. In addition, we supported the water contractors and the South Delta in trying to deepen some channels over in the South Delta because of the conflict between pumping and water levels in the South Delta. So we support that and have supported. In addition, in terms of our landowners have participated in this program, I guess we call it the RIP program, experimenting with what the savings might be from changes in farming practices. The agency is not enthused about becoming the water source for the rest of the state when they fail to develop the surplus water that was promised. But we are willing to work in an emergency. The problem was what is produced by a particular practice. So we have embraced and funded the development of the Open ET application in the Delta. And we've made very substantial contributions to it. It's a tool that we think will give you real-time data so you can gauge what the farming practice was that was changed. Some of them result in savings, and like Michael said, the evidence is probably going to show it's quite different from location to location. There are some programs that many of our people have some enthusiasm for, and that is to subsidize and encourage winter planting of wheat, for example, with the prospect of avoiding irrigation during the irrigation season when other demands are highest. That has some reception when you cut it off, because normally those wheat people in the Delta used to plant the wheat and then follow with a subsequent crop, or a lot of them did. So that's the positive things that we're working on. Of course, our unhappiness with some of the analysis and stuff that's going on, we've made apparent by repeatedly submitting our case and facts over and over again with enough repetition that I don't think anybody is reading them, but anyway, we present them. So anyway, we're here to cooperate to the extent that we don't give up. We're very sensitive to bypasses of the Delta pool, with water transfers or isolated facilities or transfers across from the east side of the valley to the west side before the water hits the Delta. And so all of that. But if you've ever seen anything we've written, you probably can gather our position. Thank you. South Delta? Come on, speak up.
Michael, just a quick follow-up question on the DRIP program. Are you in a position right now with all the data that you're pulling in to say that so much acre feet of water has been conserved?
No, we're still working from the farmer's estimates. We asked the farmer to say, knowing what you know, if you take this action, what's your estimate of savings? They're not responsible for meeting that. It's not a target. It's the initial estimate. We'll get the information through OpenET, and we'll make a comparison. I will say that the conservation measured as crop ET generally is not as high as the estimates. Now, some of that may work out in the seasonality, because we got estimates for the entire remainder of the water year. A lot of those estimates were based on irrigated crop demand, and of course, one of the requirements in the program was that observe the healthy soils process. We didn't want bare ground blowing, eroding in the wind or oxidizing. So one of the requirements was to keep stubble in the field or keep some organic matter, some roots in the ground, all consistent with Department of Food and Agriculture's Healthy Soils program. So we knew going in that, for instance, if you were not going to grow a tomato crop, you were going to leave your winter wheat stubble in, you wouldn't save all the water that you would otherwise apply to the tomatoes. But that was basically the estimate that most of the farmers used. I'll forego tomatoes. I know I put this much water on the tomatoes in my field. That's what I anticipate my savings to be. Even bare ground, as we've demonstrated in a study that was funded by the state contractors, by San Luis Delta Mendota, the state board, and farmers in the Delta. In 2018, we demonstrated that there's significant ET from bare ground. That's one reason why, as we designed this program, we didn't want to leave bare ground. We didn't want to face the erosion issue, but also we recognize that keeping a stubble crop reduces the extent to which the ground is desiccated by direct access to the sun. So that's probably more information than you needed.
I'd like to add to that. If we let the land go and take the farmers off the land in the Delta or abandon it, unless we control the drainage and the vegetation, it will consume more water than farming. And DWR studies have shown that. And they don't really take into consideration the tule growth and things like that. In other words, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with the natural habitat, but there are former studies that showed huge amounts of ET associated with tule growth and things like that. So it's not much of a solution to abandon the delta unless you have some other bright idea of getting water, because you're going to consume more water. So what we're trying to do is cooperate in here, but we have to, when the farmer, adjusts, we expect him to continue to pump to keep the groundwater off of the field, from coming up to the surface, and keep it clear of vegetation. Otherwise, you're not gaining anything. But open ET should be a simple way for us to evaluate, and you, whoever's interested, what might be the outcome of whatever practice it is. But it isn't a simple solution just to say, farmers, we're getting rid of you in the Delta, and that solves the problem. It's not going to solve the problem. And not only that, but we need those farmers when it comes time to flood fight on those levees to be out in front, because there's no agency that I know of that has the manpower ready, available to flood fight in 60 different locations once every 20 years. So there's something to funding that presence out there all the time that we need, those of us who are trying to protect the Delta. We need a viable farming community to do it, because we can't develop, we shouldn't develop into higher uses that could produce the income necessary to produce a higher level of protection. So it's an important issue for all of us. We've been able to hang on and we've improved over the years, but we are constantly running into conflict within our own governmental institutions, which somebody ought to brainstorm it to see what the hell the plan is, because there's no other interim solution that's going to come within the next 15 or 20 years. And I don't know that there is a solution. Okay, enough for me.
John Herrick, South Delta Water Agency. Excuse me. Let me just start by, Dante referenced the joint efforts to see if we can get some dredging done in the South Delta. And so I'd like to thank and compliment both the state water contractors, the federal contractors, and then the various agencies that have been involved. That's not going to solve the problems we're talking about right now, but it'll incrementally improve those. And the important part, I think, what it'll do is to remove friction between the parties, and the friction just gets worse when we have the crises happen. My approach to the topic that you've presented here is that there are two issues, and the one is, how do we address, short-term, likely anticipated, droughts? And I don't know whether that's a 1-year drought or 2-year drought or 3-year drought. That's one issue, and that requires certain planning. It requires analysis that we can't do, I can't do, and that deals with, I can say you should carry more water over to provide for the Delta in future years to meet your water quality obligations. But that's a function of flood storage space, how much is left at the end of any season. You have to leave it full at flood space in order to do that. Those are difficult things, but that can be analyzed and we can figure out, and somebody will eventually decide, okay, we're going to provide for 2 years in a row drought, and then after that, something else happens. But I don't know what that number is, but that has to be decided. The other issue, which is unfortunately what we may be approaching next year, is that there's simply no water. And no water doesn't mean no water necessarily, but it might mean some reservoirs are approaching or at dead pool. There are local requirements that will be done, but that water may never reach the Delta. There's also, it's a catastrophe. That's a separate problem that everybody has to address, because it doesn't matter what I argue what my farmers are entitled to. If there's no water, that doesn't mean anything. So what do we do? And that's the key thing. And I think that needs a lot more discussion and thought, because if there's not enough water flowing into the Delta for just evapotranspiration of regular open waterway and repairing habitat and stuff, we're doomed. And then we've got the salty delta. We don't have farming. They can't do exports until there's a huge flushing flow that comes, which will come eventually, we hope. But that's the catastrophe scenario. And I think that's a different set of problems that we have to address. And that may include things like new barriers or looking at the old ideas of, blocking the whole system at some point. There were two different places they were going to put great big gates and block the delta. I don't know, but those are the kind of things. If it didn't rain for 8 years, we might do that, because it's not just delta farmers, it's not just exporters, but I think the people of the state of California would all vote 99%. We'd like to have rivers with fish, and that requires water flowing. And so we've got to do something to protect the system as a whole in short-term droughts, and that's planning. And then long-term droughts is what's the catastrophic plan for addressing these. So I unfortunately don't have a lot of answers, but I do think that analysis, and I'm not trying to pick on exporters. I hope it doesn't sound that way, but somebody needs to do that analysis to say, okay, here's the storage in this reservoir. Here's dead pool. Here's the current flood carryover limit. When you leave more at a certain point, how does that contribute to the next year's obligations being met if it doesn't rain or rains very little? So there's a lot of scenarios there, but somebody can do that. And then we've got a better idea, rather than me saying, you didn't plan for a 3-year drought, and maybe they come back and show me a piece of paper that says, it doesn't work. We can do 2 years or whatever it is. But that has to be done in an open forum so we can all, throw rocks at it and complain. Anyway, that's my input.
Well, I think it's helpful, very helpful, to kind of pose those questions. You're not responsible for the answer, but I think breaking it into planning for drought, one of the things that I think frustrates us all is the notion of, we get into a drought, the governor declares an emergency, there are emergency responses to something that we know the best way to manage is through advanced planning. And, there has been a lot of planning, but inherent in it are the trade-offs. When you talk about carryover storage to protect against next year, that also implies the loss of water that could be distributed this year. Those trade-offs need to be faced, and it's why the value of this discussion is to have a lot of perspectives, because they are all going to be at issue. So I think that's very helpful. Secondly, the issue of salt intrusion, that is a bigger issue. We came, uncomfortably close last year to seeing that the barrier in West Falls River was very effective, but we watched as the tidal pump started to push more saline water. And, looking at that on a daily basis, I kept seeing it getting closer and closer to kind of the hump on web track, recognizing that if it gets around that hump, it gets into the flow of the McCullamy River, which would empty right into, or would drive that more saline water into Frank's Track with the kind of disaster scenario. And those response to those kind of things does take long-term planning and long-term investment and some certainty about how we will behave in those circumstances. And one of the problems with dealing with these long-term problems as though they are a series of isolated emergencies is that you don't get that long-term planning, you don't face the trade-offs, you don't get the budget. So I think it's helpful to pose the questions and to get some discussions about, because it is the case that a lot of people are working on this in a lot of different agencies and so forth. So posing the question is valuable, and I think it'd be useful to hear some of what kind of planning is going on and how are we framing the trade-offs involved in that long-term planning. Anybody want to bite on that?
As one alternative, honoring the seniority of water rights is one way to do it. The projects have responsibilities that are, I think, are clear, but they should be delineated. What we have is a repetition of emergency declarations where we just kind of act, I think, somewhat arbitrarily. And I don't think that goes to the planning. There ought to be a plan. If we can't meet the standards, you know, what is the difference that we're faced with? And then how would we react to that? But as I see it, the plan isn't even made to try and meet the standards. And there were statutes that adopted years ago to come up with a plan, and then the plan didn't work or it wasn't produced. I don't know. But somebody's got to get a handle on this. We've got demand running wild. They're going to connect California's coastal area, south coastal area to Nevada. The Colorado River is going dry. That demand in the desert is building, and I don't know. I mean, to me, I wrote the law that said that you had to have a water source, a permanent water source, in order to develop, and it passed, but it is not enforced, in my opinion, you know, to make sure that there's new water supply for new arid land development, because it's running away from, the demand is running away from us. Anyway, I agree. I think somebody's got a plan, but it can't be us. We can't afford the planning that should be done. The projects can plan it. They probably do. The meetings I've attended, they haven't presented it, but it should be presented in order to come up with various alternative reactions that make some sense ahead of time. The planning ahead of time, I think, is important for all of us, aside from trying to make sure the Delta doesn't fail in between while we twiddle our thumbs.
So I hear you say that neither the South Delta Water Agency or the Central Delta Water Agency can do the planning. But I also hear that, number one, a recognition that you want to participate in the planning and participate in the solution.
As far as participating in the planning, I don't know that we add very much. We'd like to be able to speak to everybody, ought to look at what the plan is and have a hearing or something to comment on it or criticize it or whatever, just to point out shortcomings. There may be none, I don't know. But it's not that we want to get in and tell the people how to plan their projects. What we want to do is be able to put comments in or critique it in some respect, as well as everybody else should have that right. But there has to be a plan. I think that's the issue that John's presenting. There's got to be a plan of what happens if we just continue to have droughts.
This is Brett Baker with the Central Delta Water Agency. This is just one thought I have to add to Dante's point about honoring water rights. We have I continually read and I continually see that we have a priority-based system here. But for me, it looks more like a binary system. You're either on or off. You know, I mean, what priority in the last 70 years have you gained if you have a date of 1915 or 1967 or 1975, you're all off at the same time. So to me, I don't know, I find some problem with that, in that it comes too late and it cuts too deep when you should have started earlier with younger priority.
I hate to have the Delta agencies monopolizing the conversation here, but since we know so much, that's a joke. Well, let me just pose a question. I don't mean to put the contractors on the spot, but I mean, you know, let's assume we get through this problem. You know, it rains next year a lot. Great. the contractors don't want to go through, 3 or 4 years of zero allocation. So, and again, this is not trying to be nasty or anything, but, they have to be thinking about something, and it would be helpful to hear that. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's the tunnel. It doesn't matter, but there has to be a solution for those poor farmers who, the wrong time of the year, they get that notice that, by the way, you're getting zero this year again. That I serve on a lot of boards, and some of them have, contractors on the kind of the west side there, closer to Tracy. And hearing their stories, it's just horrible. They're trying to get some wastewater from here, and they're doing this and that, and they've all this problems. And they, we're going to go broke this year or not. So I'm not putting the burden on the contractors, but I assume because it's their initial horrible result, to put it badly, they have to be figuring out or thinking of, what do we do? Because we could have a 4-year drought, right? And I don't want my clients and everybody else's clients to be broke. I mean, we won't be able to fix the system after it starts raining again. So anyway, if they can help us or give us some indication what they think can be done, we can always argue about, we're first, you're second. That's fine. But once we get some sort of outline of a plan, then I think we can move forward and try to figure something out. We're at the point now where, I am, and Dante is too. We'd like to cooperate in something rather than just be in the, well, I was going to use a horrible expression, but I can't do that in public. The sour balls there. But there's got to be something to do rather than us all give up on the Delta and agriculture in the valley. So I hope the contractors can at some point say, this is our proposal for addressing multi-year drought. And then, of course, sadly, if we have the catastrophic drought, I don't know what to do there. But anyway, that's my ramble.
This is Russ Ryan again. I'm going to put my metropolitan hat on. And we are faced with, just down in our service area and where we get our supplies, Colorado River and the Delta, unprecedented situation here. It's quite dire, as my general manager informs our board that it's the first time I think we've had, both on the state side and the Delta, as well as over in the Colorado River Basin, just in amazing declines of available water. So what I'm getting at is, don't let emergency go on, in terms of resolving. I think it's a good opportunity for us to bring these minds together. Now, the thing there's 2 areas that we're up against. It's a very complex system where you have the tides versus the riverine waters going back and forth. And obviously the second part is, how do you pay for it? And then the third one, which is even more important that I've been seeing, is other stressors in the system. And I draw on my experience. I had a tour a couple of weeks ago where we took a group out on a boat. I have to do the prop at a certain angle because of all the invasive plant species. And you've got that too to contend with for water hyacinth, primrose, Ageria, and others. So, I know that this is more of a longer term, and I know there's certain Delta Stewardship Council is talking about in their science program how to address that. Quite honestly, I don't see the communication between the agencies to say, okay, yeah, we can answer this piece, or we already know the answer to this piece. This is how it kind of goes to, John, what you were saying about, what is the plan? What is the state water contractor plan? And we need more of that synergy. And I think now that we have an emergency that's facing us all, whether you're in the Delta, whether you're in the Colorado system, whether you're down south. Fortunately, my board has, down in Metropolitan, has approved for quite a portfolio of water. And we've invested in that, but we see that now we've got the issue that we're faced with Colorado River and the Delta, and it is a real problem that, it kind of, quite frankly, makes us really worried about if we go into another year of a drought And that, Michael, that goes to, you've always heard me talk about, how do we structure more of a permanent framework where we establish thresholds? And I don't know what that means, whether it's water dynamics. And, how does that get defined in a longer term program? And then there's another component that I've learned about is the forestry. Managing the forestry can save water too. And there's that, I learned that from the Miwok Indian tribe. There's a professor over at Chico State. He kind of showed me how they can manage and actually conserve water in those real areas. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that, and if folks want to comment. Thank you.
And one thing I think that we're approaching here is, on the one hand, the wish for better planning, but on the other hand, the absolute need for flexibility because the system is so dynamic. And so again, we're facing trade-offs between two different values, certainty and flexibility, both of which we need, and create trade-offs between them. So far we've had a lot of discussion from people within the Delta, and I wonder if some of the people who are dependent upon the Delta, either as operators or as people dependent on exports, to respond or to talk about some of the ideas with respect to what you see and how you're approaching this idea of having more predictability for the recurring conditions, and yet maintaining the flexibility needed to manage the system under dynamic conditions. Anybody want to bite on that?
This is Liz Kiddick, Bureau of Reclamation, Central Valley Operations Office. Can you hear me? I think one thing that we have done, and I think it's going to help a lot at Folsom Reservoir, is we have a forecasted informed reservoir operations there now. We have a new flood control diagram that allows us to store more water in the spring. And the new spillway allows us to react more quickly to flood situations. But Folsom is a very volatile reservoir. It's too small for the drainage basin that it's on. And if we let it, if we try to conserve too much water in it, we're just spilling it the next year. I mean, that even happened this year in January with those December storms. And, we ended up releasing water that it would have been nice to hold on to, but you still have the big flood risk for Sacramento below Folsom. So, we can't take a risk with that either. So, if you could do that on other reservoirs, potentially, I don't know if any of our other reservoirs would be as good of as receptive to something like that as Folsom was. But I know that the Corps is starting to look at that pretty closely, DWR as well. So that's, one, but, we have so many rules and regulations that we have to operate to that a lot of them are not compatible. And, we just have to do what the regulations say, basically. And that's why we asked for the temporary urgency, change petition this year, because, we didn't have the water to do everything. And that's what happens in the drought. So it's, I don't have any good suggestions of what to do. But I just know we struggle with this every day. Every day we run through, what's the Delta doing? How's salinity in the Delta? We had issues the beginning of this month with salinity. Things look really good now. We just got through that high tide. But, and because of the Sac River settlement contractors' actions on the Sacramento River, depletions are much, much better than you would expect any, third year of a drought like this. So that has helped tremendously. But, they're making a huge sacrifice as senior water right holders there. So, I don't know that that's a long-term solution either.
So, but that's really helpful. I mean, two important things. We talked about Open ET and the benefit on the horizon of more real-time, credible information on crop ET, not just in the Delta, but throughout the watershed, throughout the West, because this is a Western-wide problem. So we talked about that, and then Liz, you bring up forecast-informed reservoir operations, which I think has a lot of promise where it's been, it's got a lot of promise, and it's been tested in areas where it has improved the ability to respond flexibly to the dynamics of changing atmosphere. And secondly, the example of the Sacramento River contractors, and I would say the dry year response program of trying some things that maybe are voluntary steps away from enforcing my contract or enforcing my priority or something. So ideas about how to operate more cooperatively. And one of the things maybe also related to that is how do we better manage the vacated groundwater basins? A lot of, obviously Sigma is focused on that, and we don't have the floodwater that was, the basis for a lot of groundwater sustainability planning. We'll capture stormwater, get it into the ground, and people have made investments in that, and we've just, been doing that during this prolonged drought, so we haven't seen impacts of that. But are there other things like that that we should be talking about, or things that the project operators or the water contractors wish that Delta would consider or implement, or are there ideas outside the Delta about what the Delta could do to reduce overall risk?
So this is Adam Nichols. I'm the Regional Resources Manager for the Bureau of Reclamation and the Planning Officer. It sounds to me that we're hearing here today that folks want to have more planning involved with how we plan to address operations and exports and Delta conditions. And we have a lot of venues in which we're addressing this, and they're maybe not talking to each other. I think a lot of that is too, we're very short-staffed, like I'm sure that all of you are at this time. We're having critical staffing shortages. I want to lay that as an excuse to short-sighted planning. We do hope that we can do better planning with our groups. I will point out some of the things that are going on. We do have some drought contingency planning that we are doing as an agency. We do temperature management planning on an annual basis in coordination with the board and DWR and our constituents. And then this year we also had, as we went into our third year of drought, and many of you were participating in our transfers discussions, as well as our municipal and industrial water shortage policy and public health and safety needs. That all said, there are opportunities, and what I'm hearing from this group is that there needs to be a greater, more concerted planning effort. And I guess I would propose potentially something along the lines of like an appraisal level entry into our planning studies where we can get a lot of ideas on the table and start to sort out what are these economically feasible potentially and what can move to the next stage in terms of feasible. I will also note that the Bureau of Reclamation has a good deal of funding set aside into the bipartisan infrastructure law. Things like brackish water, salinity, projects in there. We have small storage projects. We have, and a lot of those things we have yet to actually sort out how we get that funding out the door. So this type of planning effort that you guys are proposing today, I think sounds very promising to get something, and maybe it would take the leadership of the Bureau of Reclamation and DWR, along with our colleagues at the board, and bringing everybody here who's interested at the table and beyond into an initial planning phase of like appraisal and then getting things into the next jump. I think that's what I'm hearing. If I'm wrong, correct me, and if you see that there's any other opportunities for moving forward with those thoughts, I'd appreciate it.
John Herrick again. That sounds good. Let me just go back to an issue that I think is the underlying one, and that is if everybody's mandated to address climate change in the future, and the climate change forecasts right now are generally, more rain, less snow. It may change during this year when it's coming down. So I assume, I don't know this because I'm not involved in it, is the Corps of Engineers with every major dam going through and reanalyzing their flood curves. I mean, they have a flood plan book, right, or whatever they call it. So, it's, again, I don't know anything about this, but it's possible that because of the climate change scenarios, that they're going to require more flood control space, and which means you can't have as much carryover for other purposes. I don't know that. Maybe they aren't contrary things, but those are the kind of things we need to know up front. If somebody's going to change the rules of upstream large reservoirs, that determines whether or not there's enough water in storage for meeting obligations in either the current year or the future years. So we need to know that right away. Now, the issue of the hopefully there's more rain sometimes, but so maybe there are a lot of efforts going on. Not maybe there are a lot of efforts going on to redirect that, put it in groundwater, do sorts of things. Those are all good projects. Everybody should support those, I think. But we need to know what the rules are going to be for operating reservoirs, because it doesn't matter if I say, oh, you should have another 500,000 acre feet of storage in there carryover, and they look at you and say, well, that's not the rule, buddy boy. So those are fundamental things that we need the Corps or the Bureau or the DWR, we need them to tell us about, okay, this is what we think is going to be the future for operating the dam under these scenarios that we're mandated to provide for. I mean, these aren't maybes anymore. They're mandated to plan ahead for that. So anyway, that's my input.
Well, and I'll just note, because Andrew Schwartz isn't here, but DWR has created a position which Andrew fills for climate change analysis and adaptation for the State Water Project. So that is a new position, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And also, we're all aware that DWR is retooling its runoff forecasts in light of last year's experience. So there is a lot of work being done on this, and a lot of it is posted on websites. And I think, Adam, your point, we could all do a better job of coordinating all the work that is going on so that it can inform each other. And a lot of that depends on common data standards so that information that is developed is available to basically anybody who wants it to help improve their understanding and ability to plan for what's going forward. So those are some important things, and bring the Army Corps of Engineers, if they're the responsible agency for reevaluating flood risk in light of climate change, and having that information not just posted, but in a format that can be used by other studies, other planners, et cetera. So those are, important actionable suggestions. And I would say that next Monday, the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meets, and that's the group of 17 state and federal agencies who share various responsibility for operation or regulation or management within the Delta watershed. And many of these issues are squarely on the table, including a major rethinking of the entire Delta monitoring program to make it more interoperable, understandable to people, and to capture whether the data is captured by scientists at the United States Geological Survey or the Bureau of Reclamation or the Department of Water Resources or a boater from Discovery Bay. There's got to be a way of coordinating that information. The citizen science effort to identify quickly where HABs are occurring gives us more understanding of that to deal with the problem on a more flexible basis.
Let me just, sorry for being a contrarian. The predictions of the runoff last year that were so far off, before we make conclusions and recommendations to address that, I say this seriously, it sounds horrible, but can somebody make sure that somebody just didn't drop a decimal point or something? And, you know, because they were so far off. Oh, well, it was a dry year, and well, it wasn't, 115 degrees all year. And, we've had droughts before where the water that soaked into the ground was, but somebody needs to check that before they go too far. I mean, that sounds horrible, but somebody messed up.
And I forget Mr. Rosardo's first name, but we've had a number of presentations that kind of go into that from DWR. And I think I would say that there's a pretty strong sense of what went wrong, how much of it was associated with the historic averages that are no longer average. But actually, they've published quite a bit about what went wrong with that, and there's a big effort at DWR to improve it. And I think there is a lot of information on
I think
that.
it's a bigger problem than that. I think we obviously have adversarial parties. And a lot of the data that we're dependent on is developed by one of the parties. And if we were an independent venue, like a court, the credibility of a conflicted party would be questioned seriously. Now, the magnitude of dealing with the facts and the figures is huge here. So you need a huge organization to do it. Errors are one thing, but credibility is another. And the availability of information, the sources that I've used to get information on project operations and stuff have been changed. It's much more difficult now, at least for me, and I don't profess to be an expert, but I've spent a lot of time dealing with it. A lot of that information now has been shuttled off to where you can't find it. And a lot of the data is not current. It's being evaluated like for a year or something. So when we talk about data, I think we got some problems that exist there. I can't accuse anybody in particular. It may just be error, or it may be lack of knowledge. But as far as disclosure for the public, you can't work it. In other words, you go to the site that the state board has for the backup for the water availability thing, and you start trying to download some of that stuff, go ahead and try it. I mean, it becomes a worthless reference. I mean, if it was in PDF form, we might be able to, download it. Somebody puts it in some other kind of form of some kind. I mean, I have a computer at my desk, but I'll tell you what, I can't make it work. And so that opportunity to look at that data, if you want general input, it's pretty tough. And the Corps ought to be involved in this planning effort, to a much greater extent. Now, we interrelate with the Corps during floods. And we've improved that to where we have conference calls on a regular basis for that day-to-day operation. But they're not involved in this water thing that I see. I don't see them appearing at the board hearings or anything like that with regard to reservoir operations and things like that. So we've got a long way to go, but we got a hugely complex system and issue in front of us with a lot of measurements. And every time I've been involved in measurement, it's not very perfect. The stream flow cross-section, the ability to get the right reading out of the tool you're using to measure and all of that. There's so many variables in that, that the data that we're dependent on, I think is, first of all, it's hard to criticize, but it's hard to even evaluate. And we're doing a lot of estimates, accretions. I mean, I was telling the water master back in 96, 97 drought, we had very comprehensive challenge from the Department of Water Resources that had comprehensive review of trying to estimate. Byron Bethany was in that suit too. Byron Bethany and others, but accretions, the depletions that are occurring in our groundwater basins upstream. I mean, we let somebody transfer water and groundwater substitution. Okay, that may not have an effect, but it does. These groundwater basins have come down in elevation, even though they might not be critical in terms of accretions to the downstream areas and losses from the river. They're significant, and those are hard to estimate. They're impossible to measure. So a lot of this depends on somebody a lot smarter than I am to figure out how to deal with it fairly. But we have our adversaries producing the measurements and the data, and they're making it tougher for us to look at it. That's what I see.
Michael?
I know I'm going to make somebody.
Oh, no, because you keep looking at me. This is Anna Falk with DWR. And I heard the department name got brought up quite a few times, so I feel like I have to say something. And thank you very much for this. This opportunity is a great way to coordinate, cooperate. And department is working on the forecast-based reservoir operation. On. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yeah. So we try to improve the data. Data is valuable. It's gold. And yeah, so we are working on the forecast inform reservoir operation. The department is coordinating with Yuba Water Agency, so Oroville and New Boulevard operation. So it has been a multi-year effort. I'm not the one who coordinate that, but I know that that's happened in a weekly basis. And then the forecast for the department, we understand the error we made, and we are working on a different method to improve it. So we hear you, and we are working hard to improve it. And also, Adam mentioned quite a few efforts that has been ongoing coordination, and if there's additional need for more opportunity for us to understand and then to coordinate, we're happy to participate. And then the Delta study, with the fund, with the grant, it provides opportunity to gather more better understanding of the consumptive use situation in the Delta. So I myself is excited about that. So thank you.
All right, I've got a question. Is there a plan on the part of the department and the Bureau to try and comply with the conditions of their permits? And has there been such a plan? Because Michael and I have been on the same call with the CalFed, and when I asked the question was, are we planning, is there a plan to try and meet the water quality standards? And I was told that it's above them that it's not a subject to be dealt with at the CalFed discussion, and that they are doing this forecasting process, which doesn't, it's different than trying to plan to meet the criteria of the permit. I'm not saying they meet it. I don't think they can meet it. Just not enough water has been developed. But the fact that there isn't even a plan to try and meet it and show how it is and how much we're short, like John was saying, to get a handle on it so that the decision makers, the policy makers, know how critical this problem is. We're sloughing it off with emergency declarations and so on and so forth. The political pressure isn't being acknowledged with the seriousness that it has to have in order for us to find a solution for the state. So is there a plan to meet the conditions of the permit? Because they come down on us, this guy over here, if we're not in compliance, he sends out a bunch of investigators. They go through our whole thing, throw us up against the wall, and we can't afford to do it for compliance. And we would like to see the same thing applied equally to those of you who have junior permits, particularly the projects.
Yeah, so this is Anna Falk. Unless, I think my understanding, the operator, including Les, we work very hard to comply with all the regulations. It's one of our, those are our constraints in the operation. So let's go ahead.
Yeah, we do a forecast every month, and we started this year, with our first information from DWR in December, actually. Of course, then we had the rain, and everything looked great. And then, after that, as you know, we had 3 dry months. But we develop a forecast every month in close coordination with DWR. And our main obligation in that forecast is to meet the permits. And so we go through a whole scenario where we meet everything. We meet all the contractors, senior water right demands. We meet the permits. And then we see what happens to the reservoirs. And what was happening to the reservoirs in February and March was, down to nothing. And so then we have to back off and decide, okay, what can we do and what do we need to ask for relief from? And that's how it usually develops. And, I have to say in June, we did pretty much meet, even though we had a TUCO for the salinity in the Delta. We had a different station to meet. We pretty much met the regular D1641.
The forecast is where I have a problem. We've had prior drought years that have shown us what could happen to us. You could take an extreme event that has happened in the past and apply that rather than a forecast. What the forecast does is use probability in the analysis rather than the constraint that could possibly hit us, which would be the past. Well, we had a 6-year drought, 7-year drought that was the basic of planning for the 2 projects. That was the 29 through 34 period. That was a fundamental planning test for determination of firm water for the projects that was done. And I think that at least has to be done in order to get to a point of what it is realistic. I realize if we got a problem, we don't have enough water, we got to do whatever we have to do. But I think the plan has to anticipate to help all of us, particularly the political climate, understand what that real shortage is in water supply versus demand in this state.
Well, I think some of those studies are being done in a planning type scenario, but we don't deal with that in our office. We're just real time.
Well, that's what I get out of the calls that I join and just sit there and listen. And well, we can't do that. That's decided somewhere above us.
Well, but to be fair, that is the trade-off. You've got to have flexibility to respond to a wet December and a dry 3 months to follow. And, that's operational issue. The longer-term planning that you're talking about necessarily moves back, looks at averages, looks at black swan events, and prepares for it. So those are interdependent but separate efforts.
Yeah, but
And
the
I know
problem is the
John
allocation.
waiting to get a
yeah.
word
The
in edgewise.
allocations are made based on the forecast before you know what the conditions are. So you could trap yourself in a short situation with moving water in the wrong direction before you know what actual conditions are. I mean, we're not going to be able to anticipate them perfectly, but at least you got your feel. What happens if the worst happens to you? You'd understand it anyway. Thank
This is Tim Stroke, Restore the Delta. May I have a turn? Hello?
John, go ahead.
Yes, please speak.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I just wanted to comment that Restore the Delta feels that the state is way behind in planning and sharing data, particularly with DWR, and that we support the majority of John Herrick's comments today. We need some emergency plans, we need long-term planning, and we need short-term strategies. We'd also point out that Liz Kiddick of Reclamation pointed out that the Sacramento River settlement contractors did sacrifice to help both projects out this year. We think that's an important piece of this. We believe that in doing this planning at different timescales, you're going to have to confront the water rights priority system, because when supplies get too short, it doesn't make nearly as much sense to continue prioritizing some over the many in water allocations, including the rivers, streams, and the estuary channels. Those are my thoughts.
So, Michael, this is John Rubin with Westlands Water District, and I don't know, maybe it's best that I hadn't made this comment because I'm not sure how important it is, but where I'm focused, I'm having trouble with is the framework for discussion that you presented for this meeting. And the question that you asked, I think the ultimate question that you asked is, what should the State Water Board do to assist in management during a prolonged drought? And I don't know if anyone here can answer that question without knowing what we're trying to achieve through that management. And I agree with both John Herrick and Dante Namalini that a tool to assist in answering the question is some sort of analysis similar to what was done for kind of what we call the OCAP, the Operation Criteria and Plan. But back then, when it was done in 1992, I think the last real analysis, what the projects were looking at was meeting the contractual obligations that they have, meeting their regulatory obligations that they have through that prolonged drought, 28 through 34, excuse me. So the question becomes, what are we trying to achieve through a prolonged drought? And I think I would hope that our objectives are much greater than the area that you identified as maybe an area where we have common interest, which is on salinity control. I would hope that our interest in terms of managing through a prolonged drought allows for water supply that's needed for the regions that are either dependent on the delta or that use the delta to convey water, and to meet the ecosystem needs through the drought as well. But we don't have that vision, or we don't have a common perspective on what we're trying to achieve. You know, it's great to manage salinity through a prolonged drought, but that doesn't meet Westland's needs. I mean, should we expect to receive 0% allocation through a very long, prolonged drought? I don't think that should be our goal. And I think, to me, that's the question. I mean, we can get into the weeds, we can talk a lot about these issues, but it's very difficult for me to answer a question like, what should the State Water Board do to manage if we don't know what they're managing for? What is our vision? How do we provide advice to the board on that question?
The supply was planned to come from North Coast rivers for 5 million acre feet by the year 2000. That wasn't done for various reasons. So the projects are short and have been short 5 million acre feet since the year 2000.
But Dante, this is where we can devolve, I think, into a discussion that may not be productive. I mean, this is where we start getting into this issue of, okay, the projects are short. And like for Westlands, we understand that we're not going to have the supply that we had prior to 1992. We understand that, and I could separately talk to Mr. Herrick about the things that Westlands is doing to plan, knowing that that its CVP supply is not going to be as reliable as it was. But we could also face a circumstance like at least some of us think we're facing today, and that is the supply that those within the Delta thought they had doesn't exist either. And so to me, we can devolve into that conversation. I don't know how productive it is, or we can say, okay, where do we want to be in the future? And then talk about how we get there.
Well, we support your downstream storage attempts to increase storage of San Luis. We support the Los Vaqueros expansion that would include water for Westlands. We just don't want it isolated from the Delta pool as you take water over to it. But those make sense. We've got this Delta smelt reverse flow criteria at Old River. That's from the Central Delta standpoint. I don't know whether there's even a real good basis for it, but that keeps a certain amount of export that we think could be done without objection from us for sure. There are things like that, and then there's programs going on where they're putting hatchery smelt in the Delta. They found one over at the pumps. Well, that depends where you put them in the Delta. They're going to get sucked over to the pumps. I mean, and somebody's going to come back and say that that hatchery smelt ought to be treated as an endangered species. So we ought to be coordinating a little better if we can. Now, we don't consider ourselves as having a great deal of influence within the administrative bodies. I mean, we react as we can, but we don't direct policy. Policy comes from the big boys and from you guys and others, and we're not a player in it. And it's politics on top of everything on all of us. But anyway, there's things that we would support, but it's a quantity problem in the terms of supply and an increasing demand that's just running away from all of us. So we got to figure out what we can do on supply. And he's talking about the big picture. The big picture has got to be addressed.
Okay. Michael, I have a question. Most of this discussion is about moving vast amount of water north to south through, engineering, incredible engineering achievements. My question, I think maybe this is directed to Russ, is what's being done locally to address this problem? And in particular, what's happening south of the Tehachapi's with respect to desal plants? Anything? I mean, it seems to me we keep wanting to drive an Etzel when maybe a Tesla's available.
Interesting. We had a conversation yesterday internally, and as part of our portfolio, what's being done is, granted, conservation takes you to a certain extent. We have that, water recycling, and the desal is being looked at. And as you know, that's quite a horizon for a planning horizon. But we are looking at various locations, for desal because, again, it fits into our portfolio. It's a really expensive endeavor, but again, that's something that we're looking at. That's as much I could tell you at this point.
And this is Lindsay Kameyer with the Delta Water Master's Office. So also, I know that Metropolitan is working on a big recycled water treatment plant, as well as the city of LA is also, decided because of the recent drought that that a previous project for recycled water that they thought was infeasible due to cost, now all of a sudden made sense on paper. So I think there's a lot of movement with that recycled going forward. And also the Water Boards is changing its regulations as well regarding recycled water for potable use and how cities can incorporate that. So I think there's going to be probably a little bit more movement on the recycled water front than maybe on the desal front.
Yeah, that's further along in the planning and design phase, and so that's absolutely correct. But it's not just that. That's not going to solve the urgency that we have right now. We're doing our best, obviously, for 20 plus million people in Southern Cal, but again, our portfolio push. We have Central Valley groundwater management programs. I actually started those up back in the 90s with semi-tropic Arbor Edison. So we still have those as part of the portfolio as well. As best I can tell you is we're just moving the water drops around as they fit. And obviously you may have or may not have heard of the news, announcing with the governor's declaration of conservation. And yeah, we can get into the debate on that, but everybody has to do their part is kind of the messaging on that.
Hi, I'm OSHA Meserve. I represent a lot of Delta interests over the years, and I think it's a good conversation that's happening. I guess, I think we're all kind of fishing around for like, how can we get together on this stuff? Because there's so much dispute and conflict at the same time. And so I think we're all grown-ups and we know how to work together, as you've heard today, on specific projects, and that's very helpful, and we need to do that to make it work in this complicated and changing system. But I will say from an in-Delta perspective of small agencies, farmers, community groups, environmental groups, our capacity is limited, which I think Dante has pointed out. And, we do our best to try to be everywhere and be part of positive, moving forward on things that we can work together on, while at the same time defending the turf that we think is necessary to protect the interests in the Delta that are, we think worth protecting in their current form, and that are providing a lot of public benefits locally, statewide, for the environment, et cetera. So, I think one of the things that I think is a real rate limiter on the ability to move forward with the discussion that the Water Master has attempted and has begun today with this is, these zero-sum game fights that are also happening at the same time. On the agenda today is the Friant, et cetera, complaint against water diverters in the Delta, and the outcome of that. So, head-on efforts to try to stop, some of the oldest water rights in the Delta that can't store or transfer really water. We don't have anywhere to put it except for to use it beneficially, and I think there's good conversations happening about conservation and practices, and I think there's a lot of openness to that. So, but that's, a direct attack on, our water use. And then as well as the tunnel is just looming over us still. I've been working on that issue for 14 years. A lot of people in this room have been working on it a lot longer. And that's a zero-sum game type thing that takes a lot of capacity. Many of us in this room spent 3 years here at the board trying to lay out why we thought, all the different positions on that. So, if I don't know how to create the space to make the room to have the discussion that needs to be had to deal with the challenges we're facing. But I do know from my perspective, we need a reprieve from some of this other zero-sum game attack stuff going on in order to spend the energy and the time to work on these amazing solutions that I think are there and that we could get around. And, we just lost Jonas Mitten. He worked together with Westlands and others on the Coalition to Support Delta Projects. I'm kind of hearing little parts of some of those ideas. We've got the ability to do brackish water treatment when we need to in the Delta potentially. We've got to be able to let those people divert when the water quality may be crappy, because that's the whole point of a brackish water system. We've got the upper watershed work that Russ alluded to, and which I think is a huge possibility for us to work together with other parts of the state in the areas that drain into our rim reservoirs, because that's where the water starts out, and we kind of spend a lot of time down in the Delta, but that doesn't impact what flows into the Delta at all. So there's a lot of capacity, I think, possibility. And then continuing to work on the freshwater pathway, which has really been one of the bright spots, I think, in working together across a lot of different people. So I guess I would just suggest that, and then we need, more access to data. I guess we've got to be able to understand it and have the professionals to sort through it for us and whatnot. But I think from a Delta perspective, we need breathing room to do this stuff with DWR, the Bureau, the contractors. We're willing to work together, but if we've got the foot on our neck with the tunnel in particular, it makes it really hard to make progress on these other things that we think will be much more fruitful. Thanks.
Oh, I have a question for OSHA, if you don't mind, maybe for part of this dialogue. So I understand your position, and you talk about creating space, and you talk about it from your perspective, right? That you have a foot on your neck. Are your clients willing to do the same, take the foot off the neck of people that you have your foot on?
My foot's a lot smaller, number one, but no, thank you, John.
Well, a foot on the neck is a foot on the neck, I guess.
Yeah, I gotcha. No, I think that's the possibility that I think we're kind of toying with today, and I think we're willing to give time to. And yeah, I agree. I spent plenty of time trying to figure out what Westland's doing wrong and how I can make their lives miserable and all that crap. It's not particularly fruitful, and I probably won't win that, right? And I would say the same thing about getting rid of Delta farmers and Delta communities. I think they're here to stay. They want to be there, and they want to. So yeah, I think it needs to be a two-way street. I agree with you, John.
This is Susan Paulson. Sorry, this is Susan Paulson with Exponent, and I like the idea of creating a safe space or a forum for alternative solutions. Somebody earlier mentioned the binary, you're either on or you're off with your water right. And the Delta isn't a binary system. We know that the water in the middle of the system is a mixture of water from different sources. We know how to evaluate that for both existing conditions and a range of possible future scenarios. I think the scary question is, if we get that information, what can we do with it? What does having that information enable us to consider as alternatives to this binary on or off, and to find sort of creative and maybe more collaborative solutions? And it is kind of scary, right? Because you're giving up something in order to have that dialogue. But again, maybe creating that safe space for it would allow us to apply better technical tools and to come up with some solutions that, I'm speaking personally, that, allow everybody to give a little bit and everybody to end up in a better space with more certainty, and also give us the tools and the ability to do some of that very long-range planning for catastrophic conditions should they occur, et cetera. So, there have been a number of people, including me, who've provided comments along these lines to the State Board. I know we're willing to work with the State Board and State Board staff to try to find those solutions, or at least figure out how we use that information in a productive, fruitful way. And, the offer stands.
So I'm interested, first of all, just really want to thank everyone for the good discussion, and thank you, Michael, for putting this together. There's quite a few infrastructure projects and things that can be done that were discussed, but I was kind of hoping to hear more about the collaboration and some of the areas where you've been successful in the past, or maybe through an attempt to collaborate, but you got it so far, but not necessarily across the finish line. And if we could hear more about those examples, like the conservation program that was talked about right off at the beginning, what's working, what's not working, to what extent could something like that be expanded? I know in the last drought, I worked closely with a number of folks in the Delta, and we had that voluntary agreement. And I know that there are other folks that I see here in the room that have had some good discussions, but that maybe weren't able to complete a project. So just want to hear more about those ideas, focusing on collaboration and what could be done to sort of restart those discussions if they didn't quite, end up producing something in the end? And is there a role that the board could play to help encourage those discussions?
I'll try and kill two birds with one stone. I want to address what John said over here. We don't have our foot on anyone's neck from the Delta perspective, and you correct me if I'm wrong here. The way I look at it is we're all California. All Californians are lucky there's fools like us that farm in the Delta that keep that land reclaimed. Okay, our predecessors had they were much more connected with the physical realities that we're dealing with. I see a lot of numbers and data produced that are ignorant of the physical realities we're dealing with. So I think that the point that in an unreclaimed state, the Delta consumes a great deal of more water. It's uncontrolled. Those things it will not continue to happen. That water will be lost. And there are things that we would be happy to collaborate on. There are things like creating barriers, temporary barriers, filling in Frank's track. There's a list of things I could go through right now with you that I think are no regrets actions in the Delta that would help repel salinity or keep salinity out in dry conditions. There's actions we can take during wet times that'll improve our condition during dry periods. But I don't think that characterizing it as the Delta having anybody's foot on or having their foot on anyone's neck is accurate at all. We would like to maintain our levees. We would like to be good role players. So I have a hard time with that idea that we're out stepping on people. I don't want you to have a 0% allocation 6 years running, but that is the position you're in. That's the position you started at. So as opposed to reshuffling the deck or recreating or reconfiguring the rules, I have to take issue with that. I don't believe there are anything that we do to intentionally cause harm to others, and we are happy to collaborate. And going forward, I would be happy to collaborate with anybody on some no regrets actions in the Delta. I think that there are plenty of them, but there's just not enough political will to achieve some of those things. They're not sexy. They're just not big enough.
Brett, I want to respect Michael's comments about where we stay focused here. And because of that, maybe you and I should talk a little bit further offline, because there's a number of examples I can give to you about actions that Central Delta's taken your client that I see falling in that category that you say doesn't exist. But I do appreciate the offer to talk about collaborative efforts.
And one of the things I'm hearing about collaboration is that you got to have space for it. It's hard to carve out a space where you're collaborating, where your lawyers and you are all concerned about doing something that will be inimical to your interests in the litigation. So that's one thing that I'm hearing is there a way to carve some space and time to have the opportunity to explore things that will not fix the problem, but maybe incrementally contributing to solution. The other thing, though, that I think is kind of unsaid, and I'm a little worried about saying it, is the issue of whether the allocation system that we've got, the legal constraints, the way the priority system works, the fact that the riparian system and the appropriative system have different ways of allocating shortage that are incompatible. I wonder if in that space, what people are hoping for is that there'll be a change in the way the precious resource will be allocated, whether it's a tweak and a change in the way the current allocation system works on a priority basis, or a correlative share shortage, if you can make those compatible. So I don't want to, I mean, maybe we're getting into the issue here about whether the system we've got, back to your point, John, what are we managing for? It may be that we have to develop new tools if we're going to manage for new objectives. But I see a hand up over there.
Jennifer Spalletta, and I actually represent the regulated water diverting community in various places in the state, including the Delta, but also outside the Delta. So I want to address the specific question that you raised for this meeting today, and I also want to make an observation. I've been working on these issues now since 1998, and the state board in earnest took up investigation of Delta water rights in 2010. So since 2010, there's been a lot of back and forth about the priority of Delta water rights and what that means in a drought, and whether that system should be changed. And to be very frank, while that was going on over the last 12 years, riparian demand on all of the tributaries to the Delta increased and hardened. And that, along with a lot of other pressures, makes it so that our system doesn't work particularly well, obviously. So, in my view, just based on my experience, all of the back and forth about whether the Delta gets water in a drought or Westlands gets water in a drought, or whether the reservoirs can be operated differently, is somewhat of a red herring to the fact that the system at this point in time is simply not going to work well in an extended drought. And so we have to recognize that reality. And so what the state board can do to answer your specific question, in my opinion, is that the state board can do the best job possible administering post-1914 water rights and collecting data on all other water rights. And I think the state board has started down the path of doing that job better than it did in the past, but it has a ways to go. It is still very difficult, as Dante mentioned, to go onto the state board's website and obtain, as a regulated member of the water using community, accurate, timely, user-friendly information about the system. There are many large water rights that are not being measured and reported in real time. We are working right now in a drought with demand data from 2018, as opposed to real-time demand data for our largest diverters. There are so many ways that we can improve the data collection and sharing for our water system. And that in and of itself, I believe, will probably do more good for this system than all of the discussions we're having today about who should give up what in a drought. Now, second thing, we cannot change at this point in time, in a short time frame, the limitations of the physical system, climate change, or all of the disputes that we have about water rights. But what we can do is allocate risk amongst ourselves with contractual agreements. And it's just like any other business where you have risk that has to be allocated. The benefit of reaching an agreement where you allocate risk is that each party to the agreement has certainty as to what they are responsible for and what happens if they don't meet their responsibility. The only thing that is certain in the water world is that there will be uncertainty. And so I just have seen over the course of the years of working in this business that we can fight about the uncertainty, we can fight about the priority of rights until we're all blue in the face, and we will all achieve some type of win or loss in litigation or in regulation, but at the end of the day, we will still have uncertainty. And as long as the reasonable beneficial use doctrine exists in this state, whoever is in power at the time can make a decision under it that changes the rules.
And for the water user community and the environmental community, that reality is frankly not a good one. And so I just would encourage the parties here to think about all the ways that agreements can be reached to obtain certainty and allocate risk. Those agreements do not have to be indefinite. They can be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. They can have exit clauses. I know John Rubin and I have talked about types of agreements like that, but it probably takes 10 different agreements. This is not a one-size-fits-all problem and solution. I have lots of questions about the arrangement the exchange contractors made with the Bureau this year, but I certainly applaud them for making one because it obviously, according to Liz, helped the system, which is the goal. So, those are my comments. Again, like I said, just in summary, I think to the extent we can allocate risk and obtain certainty and try new things that we haven't tried before and learn from them, that is a very good thing and something that we can control. I do not think it necessarily involves the state board, other than to simply facilitate and recognize and allow those things to happen. But I strongly believe the state board needs to continue its current effort to improve the administration of the water rights that it is responsible for by collecting data and ensuring that everyone who is diverting water is complying with the same data collection rules, and that that data is equally accessible and usable and timely. Thank you.
This is Russ again. I thank you for your comments, because one of the themes, there's two themes I want to talk about. One has to do with data. You're absolutely right. Everyone should have availability. There's no reason not to have availability of the data. Otherwise, you can't have the intelligent conversations on the differences of opinion on that data. But it's got to start somewhere. And I'm a firm believer of data and using that data for those conversations. The second area is we talked about collaboration. When I came on board and working in Delta issues, roughly about 2008, and then purchased the islands, and I managed them, I made a concerted effort through various venues like the Delta Protection Commission, South Central Delta Water Agency, to reach out to them and say, where can we agree? Let's start there, because there's some common denominators is a good starting point. Water quality is one of them. And I think we may not agree on a lot of things, but we're having the discussion and we're trying to learn what better fits for the overall objective for everybody. And we understand there are always nuances, but I'm an optimist and a firm believer in collaboration, and I keep pushing that mantra forward. Thank you.
This is John Herrick again. I agree with much of what Jennifer said, but I have a fundamental disagreement with the overall approach. I don't think it's an issue of people not making the best efforts or work collaboratively. The eons I've been doing this, we've been part of 15 different processes trying to get together and do things, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The reason I'm interested in the analysis of upstream storage capabilities or changes is that leads us to that ultimate question, which is what I think we're all avoiding here. And the ultimate question is whether the system's going to work or not. And it may not. And so if we get down to the point where we say we have projects that can't deliver water under these certain rules, and if we have a drought, there's all these problems, we can't do these things, then that's when the political powers get together. Somebody decides to change rules or not. But it's difficult to ask anybody at this point to change the rules, right? Because, I can't go to Jeannie's clients and say, well, you guys shouldn't take as much water upstream because the downstream wants it. I can't say, you guys should have zero allocation for 5 years when we have these conditions. But if we go through that analysis and we show that, and I'm just making this up, I don't know what the results would be. If we show that, okay, you can't meet regulatory obligations over a 3-year period if you plan ahead, then we got to start all over, right? And when that's occurring, those issues of priority will eventually be finalized, decided, changed, or whatever. But that's the fundamental issue, is that priority with a lack of supply. And so once we do the analysis that shows under what circumstances something works under one set of rules, then we can make decisions. That's my view.
But John, don't we know that already? I mean, we know that if we see it today. The system's not working as it was originally designed. And that's what's creating the tension, right? I mean, I've heard Dante talk about the expectations that the Delta has based upon what I'll call the physical solution that was established when the CVP and the SWP were developed. That physical solution can't be implemented today because of the demands, and it's not just the demands for consumptive use; it's changes in our expectations for use of project water for the environment as well.
But if we know that, then we're addressing the wrong issues. We're not going to work out an agreement that gives you water, and we say we won't have water, have our water in some area. We have to address the problem. The problem is we have two projects, right, that were based on certain things that didn't occur, and so now all these people have paid 30, 40, 50 years into a system that can't provide them with water. What are we going to do? Do we buy them out? Do we shut down ag in the state? Those are the questions to me, not the, can I work out an agreement where the X amount of water gets here this year or something?
Well, but I think that goes back to the earlier point, and that is, and I think it was you who made the point, John, that we have short-term issues and we have long-term issues. And I think the short-term issues go to exactly what Jennifer Spalletta was talking about, are those types of arrangements. They may serve in the long term as well, but for the short term, those types of agreements can be very effective to assist.
I'm all for that. I'm all for that.
Long term, I agree with you. I mean, that's the question that we've been facing: is what are we talking about? In how do we restore the delivery capability of the project of the system as a whole? I mean, the reality is what the Delta had expected in the 1940s may not be achievable either. I mean, you have a system that's very different.
I understand,
but so that's the question for us all.
That's right. But those are the choices. Does somebody want to change a system so we don't protect the Delta? And I'm not saying that's what you want.
That's not what I said. But
no, I know. But I'm saying that, in other words, if we want to have some minimum level of exports under certain conditions, but there's a trade-off. There's no extra water, and so we have to decide that.
That's a false premise. That's not.
Well, but it's not,
the right
because we got
premise.
5 million acre-feet of agricultural demand south of Tracy.
Right, but
there's no water for that.
No, that's the question this is where I came from with my earlier comments, John. Is what is the vision, right? What do we want to achieve as a state in terms of use of water that's available in the Delta? Right, and we're adapting to that. That's what was my comment. Westlands is adapting to the reality.
You guys are dying.
We are, but we're trying to adapt, and we have been, adapting. You're right, and that's what we're looking. We're looking at diversifying. We're looking at repurposing land. We're doing all of those types of things, but there's still a question about what is the surface supply that's going to be available, and we're looking at the kind of what water might be available in those high flow events. All of those things.
Those are all good things, but if we have a fourth year of drought or a fifth year of drought, the question is, does the state of California want to have a Delta? That's the question. Now, our arguments over, well, we get part of it and you can get some. Those are the tangential things. We have to look at the system and say, we don't have a system, if that's true, that can protect the Delta and the fisheries and all those things. And that's a fundamental, then we start over.
As currently constructed, I think there's a real risk, right, when you go through a multi-year drought, about what happens to the Delta, but that's what some of these things that we've been talking about,
well,
and the state as a whole, right? Are there tools that may be available, whether it's new reservoirs, whether it's Los Vaqueros, whether it's sites, whether it's new conveyance. I mean, those are all those that's where these questions are coming from.
That's right. We have to figure out how much water the state needs. Somebody has to propose how to do it. Somebody has to decide whether they're going to fund it or not. But then we have to decide how to allocate it, because it's not going to reach the demand levels for eons, probably.
Okay, but I want to go back to Jennifer's point. There are those things about which we need to know more information, about which we already know a lot. In fact, I think we all agree that we are demonstrating in this crucible of the drought that the system that we've got is not working. It's not working for anybody, but everybody is afraid of giving up their claim on what they've got. And what I think, those are going to take time to work out. I think that's Jennifer's point. In the meantime, are there things that we can do, agreements that we can make? The example of the settlement contractors this year. They've got this agreement under contract, but they agreed to forego a certain amount of that water to reduce pressure on the system. They didn't give up their water rights. They didn't say they'd do it again next year. But they're at the table proposing something to work to get through the crisis and maybe learn more that will help us deal with those longer term problems that we know are there, that are just going to take more time. So I think I'd like to get back to exploring some of that, because I think there is what we can do, what we've seen works. Is there more of that? Are there different things? And are there things that anybody can even suggest that somebody else could do? John Herrick, if only you'd do this, you'd make the world a better place. Or, John Rubin, if Westlands would do this, we'd have less conflict. Liz, if you could operate in this, different way or with these different constraints. And then we got something to work with, including maybe state board, you got to do something different than you've been doing. You're most helpful by doing these things and least helpful by doing those things. I think those kinds of conversations in real time with the pressure that the current drought creates to explore and animate those things. So without disagreeing, and I didn't hear Jennifer disagree, that there are lots of big issues out there that are going to take time and investment and political will. If we're going to put, gates in Carquinez Strait to protect a freshwater delta, that's a big issue, long-term, lots of planning, lots of politics, lots of money. You see the gates in Rotterdam, they didn't show up overnight. Those are long-term issues. Conveyance issues, which several people have brought up, those are long-term issues. We've got a delta that is failing today and will continue to fail for the planning horizon to do any of those big fixes. That's not to say we shouldn't start looking at those big fixes. And some of those big fixes we've been looking at, as people have said, for a long time already. But what are the productive areas where we can find short-term solutions that will teach us more than we know today?
The Delta is not failing today, but for the administration and emergency actions by the state board. These projects of moving water from north to south were done on the fundamental basis that only surplus water would be exported. Now you, and there's indications in the board, talk about changing the water rights systems. You change the contracts, you change the statutes and all of that, and do that without a due process hearing and without compensation. That to me is just the wrong path. We ought to be trying to work out how we're going to get water to Westlands, recognizing that they're a junior user. The project's promised to take care of salinity control in the Delta. They acknowledge that they would mitigate all their adverse impacts. Right now, there's 50% of the service to the Feather River contractors. Those are project contractors that were anticipated to be junior to the obligation to the Delta. Those are things that have to be mitigated for. These aren't new issues. These were faced when the law was put into place to allow this water to be transferred from north to south. So for those of you who think that it's proper to go ahead and rearrange the law, change the promises, as far as I'm concerned, that should not be the path to follow. We ought to try and help every bit of the state, but we should not go back on the contracts, the promises, the legislation, the underpinnings just because we have political pressure today. And the political pressure needs to be addressed in a supply and demand operation. The projects used to have firm water. They relaxed their ability to transfer water and all this and that created permanent demand that we can't handle. So anyway, to the extent that the Central Delta can help, I indicated where we're working. We're willing to do that. We've tried over the years to reach agreements. We couldn't even get the state or the federal government left the table early, but we couldn't even get the state to agree to meet Delta standards. We're willing to go through that again, but to think that we have not worked together, Ruben, you've been involved in our UOP negotiations. We had it all worked out, and Department of Water Resources Director threw water on the fire and killed our deal. Politics is a big part of this, and for politics to help play in the solution, we've got to stop covering up the problem, acknowledge the vastness of this problem. And I don't know where we would get 5 million acre feet today. I really don't know. I mean, eliminating North Coast, I'm not sure even North Coast would produce it with climate change. So I don't know that there's a solution for the total. To reduce the fighting, I'm all for that. I'd rather go fishing, although it is kind of fun sometimes to fight with John. Anyway, we're here at the table to work positively if we can, but changing the goddamn rules and the vested water rights that our people have. They bought land that had water versus buying land in the desert. And we all know the big money is made when you convert desert or arid land to irrigated. They took all the value of our systems and project and put it in their pocket. That's the way the development interests work. You know, I've represented developers over the years, and that's what the game is, and that's okay. But we're not giving up our position because that occurred.
Michael, I do want to I know we have limited time, but I think there's I do want to touch on some kind of collaborative efforts and make an addition to the comment that Jennifer Spaletta made. I think another area I thought that where there's been some very good work is on updating the State Water Board's records and efforts to try to digitalize to make that information more accessible, which I think will help us all have kind of a better understanding and access to information. In terms of Jennifer Spaletta's comment, I do agree with her. Developing data is critical. One area that I wanted to expand on, and that is, I think that it would be helpful if we spend some more time thinking about the hydrodynamics within the Delta. And one of the challenges that we have, that I've seen, is when we're looking at the inflow to the Delta, what is natural flow that's available to riparian water right holders? What's non-natural or additional water that's available to pre-14? And again, at the end of all of that, maybe the Delta, some of the representatives here are correct that there's sufficient water to support it. Maybe there's not, but there is a kind of a black hole in my mind on this issue. You look at the data that's available today, literally today, and you can go and find data that says to the CFS how much water is being pumped by the CVP at Jones or Banks by the State Water Project. You have a pretty good data in terms of you have pretty good data. But you have very good data on inflow. Obviously, a calculated.
We don't. We're measuring flow in the reservoir as a substitute for inflow coming into it. We're not accounting for prior years.
I'm speaking about inflow to the Delta. But my point is today we don't know. I mean, except if you just use the calculated outflow and look at Delta inflow, what the depletions are in the Delta, where they're occurring, and I think opening up that and just having the data could be very helpful.
It would be better to have a standard for protection of fish in the environment that is based on a measurable quantity, salinity or something like that. Not this calculated net delta outflow.
Another
source of problem forever.
Another issue that where a good example. I'll keep going until he does. Then, no, another place where it's a good example is
Riding with him,
one of
so
the
I gotta-
enforcement actions against Woods Irrigation Company. It was contentious, but we ended up resolving the issue, and the result of that is, I think, a positive that we should look at, and that is data is being produced that we could all look at and have an intelligent conversation versus having a conversation based upon a lot of speculation or uncertainty. And so,
You guys can set a meeting up for next week, and when you guys can sit at the table more than an hour, call me up and I'll come over.
Thank you. I know people are having to leave, but I do, playing off what John just said, you were involved in a year-long investigation with us into Fryan's complaint about unlawful diversion in the Delta. And perhaps it'd be worthwhile, if you want to reflect on what's different, what you learned, and what you might be doing with that additional information. And the connection there is the absolute understanding that we need better data, more real-time, more accessible, and there's a lot going on to do that.
Yeah, Ian Buck McLeod with Fryan Water Authority. We were one of the ones that sent the initial complaint early last year, and we did a pretty basic mass balance. It's posted on your website. And we were, calculating how much stored water we were having to release from both projects and looking at our net delta outflow and just looking, okay, total depletions. And that was one of our learning points, was not just diversions, like total depletions in the delta were something we had to get our handle on. But there was a clear difference kind of in May that we were really having to support the delta with stored water. And that sort of pushed, I think, a movement into the water and availability analysis that the state board is doing. And so I do see a great improvement there in the Appendix D, which some of that borrowed some of the initial work that we had presented over. I think there's been quite a bit of refinement. I know you had developed a draft response on that, and folks are providing comment towards that, which I don't need to get into too much. But I think some of the learning from Fryan's end, and we are sort of unique, we rely on the San Joaquin River Exchange Contractor reliability, which is dependent on South of Delta exports. And last year we had a virtual call where we had to send Fryan water basically to Metropolitan to exchange that into San Luis to support the exchange contractors. This year there was over 200,000 acre feet of a Fryan call, so we have a huge interest of trying to salvage as much during a critical year to meet the exchange contract. But some of the learning that we had was the overall depletions. I think there's some of the vegetation demands. There's the uniqueness of the delta, the difficulty in metering, and your effort towards open ET. What would be sort of helpful, and you had outlined some of this in the memo, is actually expanding on that areas of improvement. I think it was a little concerning because it felt like it somewhat fully discounted our analysis. Although rudimentary, the deficit is very great from what we were showing, like on the order of 2,500 CFS in the June period. And it's, okay, what's the scale of these other depletions? It's hard to deny there's the other issues. Contracts, water rights stuff, I know that gets played into it, which I don't want to muck up. But just the improvement of the Delta water use data, compliance with SB 88, kind of this alternative path with open ET. How are you putting that into the water and availability analysis and your Appendix D improvement? That's where I see some of that effort besides some of these other projects of conservation. I think the response pilot program, that can sort of help with understanding, okay, if you actually have a curtailment, what does it actually make a difference? Is pretty helpful. The only other comments maybe I would say from hearing today is in defense of some of the drought planning that the projects have been doing. I mean, in 2020, 2021, we were like 90% exceedance planning, and then this year we were doing 99% exceedance planning, and it becomes pretty difficult when we start getting worse than the 99%, like something that's unforeseen. I mean, we had the worst January, February, March. And then you have this balance of, okay, if we're always planning 98%, we're going to have massive spills of situations. And so And maybe that's to some extent where we need to be going. I think there is definitely some credence to long-term dry year planning. I don't know if that's range of carryover targets, which make, I think, really difficult for projects to manage if they're forced to a carryover target. We do have this huge competing temperature and outflow requirements, which are completely in conflict. Trying to not be too controversial, but like the spring X2, the habitat protection flow that we have in the spring is a tremendous amount of water that we're having to release, and it made us go broke last year and this year, and it ended up leading to a reason why we had to do the TUCP and TUCOs. It's going to be difficult movement to change D1641 in that area, but that is a tremendous amount of water, and if we're using a less conservative exceedance for that requirement, where we're having to do other drought planning at a worse exceedance, that makes it tough. So there's some room in our outflow requirements and the competing upstream temperature requirements that we have as well. So that's all I had. Yep.
I recognize that we are over time, so some people have already had to leave, but there are also people who've come who haven't said anything yet, and I want to give space. Jeannie, Allie, anybody else who has not had the taken advantage of the opportunity for airtime. I don't want to cut you off if you've got something to say.
I think from, to kind of piggyback off of what Jennifer said, I'll probably get kicked out of the club over here, but from my perspective, for my clients in the Delta, certainty for next year is going to be key. And I just dealt with a situation where I told my clients, oh, no curtailments this year, you guys are good, to a week later having them shut off their pump. So, and they planted their crops and everything like that. So from my perspective, getting ahead of this, and if you want something, I think, from the Delta, ask for it early and let us know, because that's going to get you an answer. Might not get you everything you want, but it'll get you an answer sooner rather than later. At least that's something that I think my clients would appreciate, rather than finding out last week that they were curtailed.
Fair point. And I would also say it gets to this issue of trying to get as close as we can with the best information we've got to real time and dynamic system. But I totally get your point.
Right. I appreciate that, but why, and maybe I'm thinking about this like too in a very rudimentary fashion, but I would assume that next year we're not going to get any rain. And so why we're not planning for that specific scenario and what everyone needs to do to survive that, I maybe I'm missing something. But that's where I think this should be going, and the state board helping as it can. But I think Jennifer's point is a good one, that I don't think the state board's going to solve this. I think this is something that's better solved among the parties. And so the sooner we start having real discussions, I mean, no one here even, well, I think Dee Diamo mentioned the 2015 voluntary cutbacks in the Delta. No one talked about that today. I know no one wants to talk about that, but I mean, we can be right, like John said earlier today, about we have the priority, we should get the water first. If there is no water, there's no point. So anyway, sorry.
Just to add, most of what I wanted to say has already been said, but in half jest, when you ask the question of what the state board can do, my response is butt out. And, that's only half in jest. When we get to periods like this, and if we get to a period next year where we have another drought year, the parties working together seem to get much more done themselves than the state board coming in and regulating and curtailing, which results in us all fighting amongst ourselves. The state board can play a part working with the projects,
working with TUCPs, waiving requirements, doing what needs to be done to get through another dry year. But, we all know your data is not as good as it needs to be to curtail people. We have errors upon errors upon errors. We've got a 20% error rate, and you're curtailing people who are using less than 2%. I mean, it just doesn't work. It causes a lot more consternation and fighting. And if we are in a drought next year, it's going to be water users working together just to try to survive. And I think that is something that can be best done by the water users and by the state board not requiring 100%. I mean, we had settlement agreements, many of the last droughts on the San Joaquin River, that were tossed out by the state board because the Bureau didn't bless them. Some of that has to be let go. And if we can get the majority of the water users agreeing to get through another year of a drought, we're going to have to do that.
So Jeannie, thanks for that. And obviously, I lived through a lot of that at the same time. And one of the concerns that I know went into the decision, because I spent a lot of time going around and around on that with Tom Howard back in the day, and it was the sense that you could get agreement from everybody as long as it could get balanced on the backs of the projects, given their responsibility to meet delta outflow and to maintain delta water quality. And so I know Tom's strong response was that getting almost everybody together, but leaving the department and the Bureau out, makes that an easier agreement, because everybody who can agree agrees that the projects will make up any shortfall in the delta by their responsibility to maintain the salinity. But I'm taking your main point that butting out could be a useful thing to do if it makes space for water users to, come to grips with the circumstance that in an extended drought, the system that we've got doesn't work. I fuss a lot about the incompatibility of the two ways of allocating shortage, which for most of the history of California, those incompatibilities never came to bind the system. Number one, because there was generally separation between riparians and appropriators. That's less the case in the Delta than elsewhere. In addition, that incompatibility wasn't so glaringly obvious when there was more water in the system and fewer demands for that water. So we are entering into a new circumstance, and we got the climate change wolf at the door, which is going to exacerbate all of that. So I take your point about agreements among parties. I don't think anybody at the state board or at the state board staff objects or would do anything but encourage that kind of collaborative effort. The example again of the Sacramento River settlement contractors giving up some water that they were contractually due eased the system a lot for all of us. Are there things like that that we could agree to do that will make the system work better for us, because it ain't working for us right now? Again, I know we're over time. I think this has been a useful place to start. And I think there are a lot of suggestions that I've got in my notes, and I know some of my colleagues at the state board have in their notes to follow up on. And again, I take the last point that this is not the exclusive or even primary responsibility of the state board. Where we can be helpful, let us know. We hear loud and clear that better, more real-time, more credible data, less combat science, all of that is a place where the board can play a role, and the board is working hard on that. It's complicated, it's tough, it's taken time, it's taken money, it's taken mind share, and there is progress being made. I think we've also seen a lot of progress on the methodology. It's much better than it was when it was first rudimentary. It's not perfect, and whether it is, how it gets improved over time, how it's been improved over time, it's a tool. The old saying, the menu is not the meal, the map is not the territory, the model is not the delta. It's really complicated. So we continue to work on that. And we recognize that that's a big, serious responsibility that we've got, and we're working at it. And we encourage your help and support in sustaining that. Deanna, you haven't said anything. You've been sitting right next to me. Would you like to say anything?
Thank you very much for convening this morning. I appreciate the discussion, and I look forward to perhaps additional discussion on this. One thing I will note that is not in the realm of the state board that I found encouraging when Adam mentioned it, and it triggered some thoughts, is just that there is a lot of federal and state money right now between the bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill funds, as well as the state. If there are no regrets projects that we can build in the Delta to deal with salinity intrusion to help us, whether they be operable gates like the 3 gates project that DWR did maybe a decade ago, but it never went anywhere. Is that something we should dust off and relook at? I heard more agreement with barriers from the Delta water agencies than I expected, and so if that's something that is worthwhile looking at, I personally have some issues with the fixed barriers, and I'd like to see operable barriers for Delta water quality issues. But I like the thought of let's work together. Now that's not something, I'm sorry, that's going to fall in your domain, but I think we have a lot of money right now that we can probably try to work on with the state and the feds on trying to get some money for some no regrets actions that could help in the drought. So.
And just on that, let me say that I'm delighted if there's work and money and mind share and effort that can be done without me and without the water board. We very much encourage that. And also, I'm coming to the end of my second term, and I've indicated to the board that I will not be a candidate for a third term. So my last day as Delta Water Master is January 6, 2023. So I'm interested in being as useful as I can be on some of this short-term stuff and continuing, but eventually handing off the baton to people who will take it further and build on a lot of these things. So I'm not at all fussed about not being in the middle of all of these conversations. I'm probably, in many ways, an impediment, not a help. Russ, I think you wanted to say something.
No, I was going to echo about, there's a lot of money out there. I echo that. We have a team that looks at all the grants, so that we're pulling them together. Resiliency is another one. Drought related, obviously, is an obvious one. One thing that I want to kind of remind folks is that at some point, the regulatory fisheries need to be involved in this, because they do have a lot more leverage through the ESA that we need to bring. I would suggest bring them in earlier, not throw something at them.
Great point. We have all got a lot of experience about coming to agreements without enough people at the table, and the people away from the table end up torpedoing it. And I just, again, want to go back and say, I will be at the end of my second term on the second anniversary of the insurrection, so it's coming up. And you all ought to be thinking, because I know the state board, who has appointment authority, is interested in a strong, capable pool of candidates to take this job. And I'll just throw that out there. Talk to people. Think about what you want in the next water master, who should do a much better job than the last guy. Well, thanks, everybody, and we appreciate it, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks. Bye.
To all of you who called in, thank you very much, and we are wrapping up the meeting. Thank you so much for joining us by the teleconference. Thank you. Bye-bye now.